Tune into Nice Radio every Saturday at 7:30 a.m. for A View from the Outside, hosted by Brereton Horne. A View from the Outside takes a look at key issues affecting St Vincent and the Grenadines and gives a global perspective on how these issues are viewed. Host Brereton Horne will examine a variety of topics to enlighten, stimulate debate, and explore solutions. Hear the facts, hear the real-life stories, hear A View from the Outside. Join Brereton Horne at 7:30 a.m. every Saturday on Nice Radio for A View from the Outside.
This society needs a spectacle. It might help us to see some people.
On A View from the Outside this week being the 20th of February 2021, we look at transparency, 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 with the view being that despite what is being projected to the outside world, there is a complete lack of transparency in the way St Vincent and the Grenadines is being governed by the regime which occupies the seat of government. The Cambridge Dictionary defines transparency as a situation in which business and financial activities are done in an open way without secrets, so that people can trust that they are fair and honest. And the Merriam-Webster Dictionary states that to be transparent, which is the adjective from which the noun transparency flows, to be transparent is to be free from pretense or deceit. Therefore, when we talk about transparency, we are talking about correctly revealing the facts and the truth about a particular issue or situation. In other words, transparency is about putting everything out in the open and revealing all for all to see. There is no question that transparency in government breeds confidence in the people, while a lack of transparency leads to corruption and distrust. With that in mind, it is clear that when transparency is neglected or stifled, then distrust creeps in and dominates and leaves a populace angry and always in need of the truth. It is in that vein that we, on A View from the Outside, highlight this topic today. Despite what they tell us, since 2001, when the current regime took control of government in St Vincent and the Grenadines, they have been having a flagrant disregard for transparency. They have deliberately, on many occasions, and in many ways, chosen to avoid being accountable to you, the people of the country. And despite what they say about being transparent and about them being a transparent and an open government, they lack transparency. Their lack of transparency points to widespread corruption in the country, and it is no exaggeration to say that corruption is rife across the structure of government in St Vincent and the Grenadines. Vincentians are commonly tricked, deceived, lied to, and starved of information, some of which the regime has a legal obligation to provide, and they do not. One of the most glaring examples of such lack of transparency is pertaining to the spending of government's money, which is approved during the annual appropriation bill, or the budget. The 2021 budget was approved just over 2 weeks ago, and yet the regime has not accounted to the Parliament for its spending for the period from 2013 to present. No audit reports for this period have been laid before the Parliament as required by law. Their failure to be transparent and present annual audit reports not only amounts to a lack of accountability, but such deliberate lack of transparency prevents the opposition from summoning the Public Accounts Committee to hold them accountable, purely on the basis that there's nothing there to discuss. There is no doubt that one of the biggest secrets in St Vincent and the Grenadines is how the regime spends the nation's money. No one, apart from a few in the upper echelons of the regime, it seems to know how the money is spent. It must never be forgotten. In fact, it must always be remembered that there has been a glaring lack of transparency regarding the money spent to construct the Argyle International Airport, the AIA. Do not forget that when the so-called coalition of the willing, who Vincentians were told or were promised to fund the AIA, when that coalition failed miserably, the regime ran to the parliament of the country to secure funds to complete the construction of the facility. And always remember also that the money spent on the construction of the AIA was never included in the budget estimates up to 2017 when the airport became operational. This February 2021 marks 4 years since the AIA became operational. Yet still, the regime has refused to be transparent pertaining to the total amount of money spent to construct it. That figure remains a secret to everyone else, but for a few in the upper echelons of the regime. At present, there is a complete lack of transparency pertaining to healthcare in the country. In October 2020, in the middle of the ongoing coronavirus pandemic, St Vincent and the Grenadines began experiencing an outbreak of dengue fever. Dengue fever, as everyone knows, is caused by the Aedes aegypti mosquito. When the news of the outbreak became public, it was reported that the region was warned by the Caribbean Public Health Agency, CARFA, that a dengue fever outbreak was likely to occur in the country. In fact, it was reported that the regime received that warning in January 2019, an entire year and a half before the actual outbreak. Yet, despite that lengthy warning, the information remained a secret. The regime kept it hidden from the people. To compound that matter, there is evidence that the regime reduced the budget for the Vector Control Unit in the Ministry of Health, Wellness and the Environment, the department which has responsibility for the eradication of mosquitoes within the communities up and down the country. As a result of that lack of transparency and care by the regime, over 1,000 people have been recorded as having contracted dengue fever. 8 of those, including children, are reported to have died from the disease. We, on A View from the Outside, express our deepest condolences to those who mourn the loss of their loved ones and whose lives might have been spared but for the secrets and lack of transparency of the regime. Pertaining to the management of the presence of COVID-19 in the country, the regime has been accused of a lack of transparency in reporting the true state of affairs to the public. In March 2020, St Vincent and the Grenadines recorded its first COVID-19 patient. The Ministry of Health, as has been done across the globe, began reporting to the nation statistics regarding the presence of COVID-19 in the country. A key feature of the report was the number of people who were in quarantine as a result of either testing positive, awaiting a test, or experiencing symptoms. Over time, the numbers simply did not reconcile or add up, and the public began asking questions about not only the statistics as presented, but the way in which the control of the virus was being managed. In July 2020, the response of the Ministry of Health was to remove from the COVID-19 daily report the number of those who were in quarantine, thereby keeping a secret from the population, a vital aspect in the management of this vicious communicable disease. The regime took the decision to be non-transparent with the public, a move considered by most to be irresponsible and deceitful. Since January 2021, St Vincent and the Grenadines has seen a steep rise in the number of people infected with COVID-19. And even then, the local COVID-19 report from the Ministry of Health has changed format and become even more inconspicuous and lacks transparency. It must be noted here that at a time when it is even more important than ever for the nation to know how many people are in quarantine or isolation, that vital piece of information remains a secret. Pertaining to COVID-19 also, transparency has been lacking regarding the protocols for people entering the state via air and seaports. A matter which has been recently exposed is whether or not those who enter with a negative PCR test and reside alone in their private homes can fulfill the current 14-day quarantine period at home rather than be sent to a hotel designated by the regime. The powers that be in the regime say that no exemptions are granted and that everyone entering St Vincent and the Grenadines must observe a 14-day quarantine period. However, at a press conference on the 26th of January 2021, the Chief Medical Officer of St Vincent and the Grenadines indicated that she used her discretion to grant an exemption to 6 people who entered St Vincent and the Grenadines on a private jet. Note that there is no indication anywhere in the protocols published by the ministry that exemptions from quarantine can be granted. There are no criteria set out as to what will be considered when deciding whether to grant an exemption, and there is no process for applying for any such exemption. The possibility and process for applying for and granting exemptions appear to remain a secret. There continues to be a total lack of transparency in that regard. Presently, one of the biggest secrets in St Vincent and the Grenadines is what happened to the money obtained by the regime to assist people affected by the COVID-19 pandemic. In March 2020, the head of the regime indicated that the government received 70 million EC dollars to use as an economic stimulus to assist those who suffer because of the COVID-19 pandemic. 64 million of the 70 million was obtained from funding agencies such as the International Monetary Fund, the IMF, and the World Bank. However, to date, there has been no transparency pertaining to the spending of that money. In fact, how that money has been spent seems to remain a complete secret. This past week, minibus operators in St Vincent and the Grenadines withdrew their services as a result of only being allowed to transport, in some cases, less than 50% of the number of passengers they are licensed to transport, without receiving any subsidies to their operational cost. The question on everyone's lips is, what has happened to the $70 million set aside to assist those affected as a result of the COVID-19 pandemic? Where is the transparency? What is the secret? Where is the money? We, on A View from the Outside, say that it is vitally important that the whistle is blown on the lack of transparency by the regime. They ought to be forced to be honest with the people. The secrets must be exposed. It is past time for the government of St Vincent and the Grenadines to be transparent with the people of St Vincent and the Grenadines. They must be forced to be transparent because people are hurting. Many minibus operators are hurting. People who got their so-called love boxes, which many saw as election bribes, are now hurting. The hurt, the pain is felt up and down the country. There is simply too much which they are not transparent about. And because of that, one has to ask whether you, as a nation, are going to demand transparency from the regime, or whether you are going to remain docile and meek and continue to accept that which is unacceptable in most countries around the world. Vincentians, each one has to ask, individually and collectively, whether what the regime does looks like transparency to you. Each one owes that to the nation. The challenge is yours. So, are you going to demand transparency for the geothermal project, which failed miserably and spectacularly? The project on which the regime has gone completely and conspicuously silent? Will you demand transparency on the awarding of contracts, government contracts? As a note, just yesterday, a High Court judge in England ruled that Matt Hancock, the Health Secretary, did not follow transparency principles and that he acted unlawfully by handing out coronavirus contracts without publishing details in a timely manner. Vincentian, will you demand transparency on Petrocarib money? Will you demand transparency on the promised investigation into alleged bank accounts held overseas by members of the upper echelons of the regime, accounts which allegedly contain millions of US dollars? Will you demand transparency on why David Ames was allowed to flee St Vincent and the Grenadines whilst he was on bail, and at a time when he faced multiple charges of defrauding taxpayers of the country of millions of dollars? Will you demand transparency on why the workers of Bucama have never been paid, despite the fact that Camilo Gonzalez revealed that they were to be paid because he was in touch with David Ames even after David Ames ran away from answering his bail? Vincentians, will you demand transparency on what is happening to bigger bigs? Or will you just continue to sit in silence and do or say nothing? There's a whole lot more that one can ask whether you will demand transparency for or about. However, because we cannot list them all here, we, here on A View from the Outside, encourage you to identify them and to press forth and demand transparency for them. And as you do that, as you demand transparency, bear in mind the words of the Dalai Lama, who said, "A lack of transparency results in distrust." Vincentians are indeed distrusting at this time. Until next week, Justin and all of the listeners, this is Brereton Horne with A View from the Outside, with a reminder to send your feedback as usual to aviewfromtheoutside@hotmail.com. We also invite you to visit and like our Facebook page at A View from the Outside, and also subscribe to our YouTube channel at JMB Horne. Have a pleasant Saturday, have a wonderful Sunday, and a productive week ahead as we all embark on the demand for transparency.